Welcome to the deep dive. Today's topic might seem pretty basic at first. We're diving into biological individuals. I mean, we all have a sense of what those are, right? Like a bird or a tree.
Right.
Easy peasy.
Yeah. Simple. Right. But get ready because it gets complicated. Turns out, defining what exactly makes something a biological individual is way more complicated than you might think, and it takes us deep into philosophy.
Yeah. And on this deep dive, we are going to move past those basic examples. We're going to really explore how scientists and philosophers think about this idea, because it's not just about a simple definition, right? It's about understanding the very nature of living things and how we draw the lines between them.
Totally.
So how are we going to figure all this out? Well, to guide our deep dive today, we have excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on biological individuals. It's like having a really well-researched guide. It's a summary of centuries of thought just for you.
Okay. So let's start with the most basic question. What actually are biological individuals? Seems simple enough, right?
Right.
But as soon as you start digging into it, well, you find all these other questions tangled up in there.
Exactly. It's not just about pointing and saying, that's a biological individual. Like, the entry makes us ask, what actually makes something a biological individual? What are the rules? What's the deeper meaning of this whole category? And
Yeah.
what's the best, most informative definition we can come up with?
Right. It's like we're questioning the act of defining
Okay.
things.
And this isn't some new idea either. Figuring out what makes an individual or an organism, which is a close idea, this goes way back, like all the way to the beginning of the life sciences.
Exactly.
And historically, these terms were often used in the same way, as the scholars Lidgard and Neihart point out. And as we explore all of this, we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, good point.
So, okay, you might be thinking, easy, biological individuals were just organisms, the living things we see every day. And the entry says some scientists still think this way, citing Queller and Strassman, Clark, and others.
Right. But here's the thing. It's crucial. A lot of other folks, including Dupre and O'Malley, Nicholson and Perdue, say that biological individual is actually a bigger, broader category. They say organisms are one type of biological individual, but there are others too.
Okay.
It's even a little controversial. Some, like Okasha, don't even think this broader category makes sense.
Okay, let's break this down. If biological individual is more than just organisms, what else could be in there? The entry talks about how philosophers usually separate biological individuals from other stuff in biology, like properties or processes or events.
Right.
But then it brings up this challenge. It's called a process-focused ontology, championed by thinkers like Dupre and Nicholson, and it makes things fuzzy.
Yeah. See, the traditional view is that biological individuals have this stable set of features. They have a specific location and size, they last for a certain amount of time, they're made of physical stuff, they have certain characteristics, and they're involved in various biological activities. Processes and events, though, they usually don't have all of these same features. But a process-focused ontology, it questions that whole separation. It says maybe the basic reality isn't these distinct things, but rather this constant flow of biological activity.
Okay, I'm trying to keep up.
But for this deep dive, we're going to stick with biological individuals as things that have those features, those stable characteristics.
Mark it. So now we get to the really mind-bending examples,
Yes.
the ones that show us just how slippery this whole concept is. So first up, the humongous fungus in Michigan. I mean, what even is that thing?
So Armillaris bulbosa. It's this massive underground network of fungal threads, and they're all incredibly genetically similar. In the early 90s, biologists published in Nature made this argument that all those threads, all those interconnected samples, they're part of one giant biological individual. We're talking acres and acres, hundreds of tons, maybe thousands of years old. They even thought it might be one of the oldest, largest organisms on Earth.
Wait, hold on. I thought a mushroom was an organism, not a whole underground network of threads. So is it a single organism, or is it a bunch of organisms, or is it something else entirely?
Right. This is where it gets philosophical.
Yeah.
Other scientists question whether it really counts as one organism or even one biological individual at all. And the entry says to figure that out, we need more than just data. We have to examine our very ideas of what an organism and a biological individual actually are. Like, if this fungus isn't a typical organism, but we might still call it a biological individual, then what's the reasoning behind that?
Right, because those are two different things.
Exactly. This humongous fungus forces us to refine our most basic ideas, the ones we use to understand the world. The data challenges our categories. Okay, so now we have our second really cool example, coral reefs. I mean, besides being absolutely gorgeous, they are incredibly complex systems.
Right. We see those individual coral polyps, little animals, definitely biological individuals.
Right.
And then there's the whole huge calcium carbonate structure that they make and live on. But conservation biologists, they talk about the whole reef, polyps, and structure together as this living thing that grows over time and can even die.
Right. So what's philosophically interesting here is that the whole thing is so interconnected. The polyps need these algae, called zooxanthellae, to get nutrients, and the algae need the polyps for protection. The whole structure of the reef is built by the polyps working together. It's this whole web of interdependence that makes us wonder, could the whole reef be considered a biological individual, maybe even an organism itself?
Yeah, the entry suggests a reef could be thought of as an ecosystem, which could have a unique kind of individuality. But when we hear the reef is living, growing, dying, it makes you think maybe it fits the definition of an organism too, like a self-contained integrated whole. And those dependencies between the reef and polyps, well, those are all over the biological world. Like, even we depend on other organisms.
That's true. Think of all the bacteria in our guts. We're definitely individual organisms, but we need all those microbes.
Right. So maybe the real question is about the type and degree of integration.
Exactly. The entry mentions causal integration, cohesion, collaboration, or agency of parts. These are all things that come up when we talk about biological individuality. So if we use those as our measuring stick, then maybe the coral reef, with all of its complex parts working together, maybe it's a stronger case for being a biological individual than a single polyp or zooxanthella by itself. Or, as the entry also says, maybe the reef represents a different kind of biological individual, an ecosystem made up of a bunch of individual organisms.
So these examples, they really show us that just pointing and saying, that's a biological individual. Well, it's not that simple. And the entry lays out 3 questions to help us explore this whole idea.
Yeah, good questions.
So first, beyond organisms. Like, how might focusing on organisms limit how we understand biological individuality?
Good question. And then second, distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
If biological individual is more than organisms, what are the best ways to tell different types of biological individuals apart? Because a giant fungus and a coral reef, even if they both count, they seem pretty different, don't they?
Right. And third, conceptual space. Like, how can we map out this whole concept of biological individuals? How do all these different examples and ideas fit together? Okay, let's start with that first one, beyond organisms. So the entry points out that for a long time, both historically and in a lot of science today, the focus is on the organism as the main example of a biological individual. Like foundational works in evolutionary biology, like Maynard Smith and Safmary's The Major Transitions of Life, they start by looking at how complexity evolved within single organisms.
Right, and that makes sense. We see organisms all around us. They seem like the most obvious examples of living things.
Right.
But here's the thing for you, the philosopher. The stuff that makes up those organisms, they're often considered biological individuals too, like our cells or the microbes in our guts.
Right.
And then those individual organisms group together into populations and lineages, which might also be seen as biological individuals, even though they're not organisms themselves.
So by just focusing on organisms as the biological individuals, we might be missing a whole lot of other biological things that have some kind of individuality. It's not just missing stuff, like the entry says, it could lead us to wrong conclusions about the nature of life itself.
Exactly. So this leads us to some more, well, let's say radical viewpoints. The entry introduces microbialism. This idea says that to really get life, we need to focus on all these relationships between the bigger organisms and microbes.
Okay.
And from that view, the organisms we easily see, they might just be a tiny part of a much bigger interconnected world of biological individuals.
Ooh, I like it. Okay, what's next?
Okay, and then there's eliminativism, even more provocative. It suggests that organisms, well, maybe they aren't even the best examples of biological individuals. Maybe they're just edge cases. Maybe we need to shift our whole focus away from them to understand biological individuality.
Whoa. That's a challenge to how we normally think.
It is. And proponents of microbialism, like Dupré and O'Malley, they say there's a bias towards those bigger organisms in the philosophy of biology. They want us to change our view to give those microbes way more importance. This has led to ideas like Dupré's promiscuous individualism.
Promiscuous individualism. Okay, for you, our listener, the philosopher, we got to break that down. It's not just saying there are multiple ways to classify things, is it?
No, it's deeper.
It's like saying multiple biological individuals can exist at the same time within the same system, each a valid individual depending on what you're looking at.
Exactly. Let's take lichens, for example. The entry uses that.
Hmm.
Traditionally, you might think a lichen is one single organism, or maybe two, a fungus and an alga. But with promiscuous individualism, you could argue there are three individuals: the lichen itself, the fungus, and the alga. You might focus on any of those as individuals for different reasons, different scientific questions. And given how many microbes are involved and how hard it is to define what an individual fungus even is, this promiscuity can get really complicated. Dupree even suggests that things like biofilms, which are multi-species communities, they could be biological individuals and organisms. So maybe what is a biological individual depends on the context in which you're trying to figure out.
That's a very, open-minded view. It reminds me of those debates in philosophy about how we define categories.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does this focus on collaboration, like in microbialism, connect with this idea of eliminativism?
Well, one connection is the concept of the holobiont. This idea was originally used by Lynn Margulis to describe a kind of inherited symbiosis. But in the early 2000s, it gained a wider meaning.
Okay.
So when we're talking about biological individuals, a holobiont usually means a multicellular organism, like us, plus all the microbes living in and on it. Some scientists say this holobiont, this whole community, is the real or the most important biological individual, not just the host organism on its own.
So what we see as a single individual, like a human, is really this huge interconnected group of human cells and microbial cells.
Exactly. And this concept is used by people who think it's key to understanding all sorts of things, like our immune systems, and even how individuality evolved in the first place.
Yeah.
But it's had its critics. Some say it focuses too much on the host and not enough on the microbes. Others question if it even makes sense as a basic unit. The entry mentions Lloyd and Wade. They came up with a distinction between euholobionts, which are communities where the genes are really integrated, and demiholobionts, which have more unequal relationships. And they think viewing this as a spectrum might help us understand mutualism and holobionts better.
So maybe eliminativism isn't about getting rid of the organism entirely, but making the holobiont more central.
Could be. But the entry also says some argue that the important part isn't that the holobiont is a kind of individual, but the process of holobiosis itself, the constant interaction and merging. And then there are ideas that ecosystems could be biological individuals, or that holobionts could be individuals and communities at the same time. Like the whole idea of what's beyond organisms just explodes our initial simple view.
It does. It makes it all so much bigger.
It does.
Okay, let's move on to our second question then. Distinctions. So if biological individual includes more than just organisms, how do we distinguish between these different kinds of individuals?
Well, a central distinction is between evolutionary and physiological or metabolic individuals.
Okay, so listener, the philosopher, what's the key difference?
Think of it this way. Evolutionary individuals, they're defined by their role in evolution, in natural selection. The entry talks a lot about Peter Godfrey Smith's concept of Darwinian individuals. To him, what actually evolves are Darwinian populations. These are groups of things with heritable traits that affect their reproductive success, and the members of these populations, they are the Darwinian individuals.
So it's about having traits that can be passed down and are subject to natural selection. It's different from the replicator idea, where genes were the main things being selected. Right. Godfrey Smith's view, it seems to focus more on the whole process of reproduction and creating parent-offspring lineages.
Exactly. And this emphasis on reproduction being super important, it goes back a while. The entry talks about James Grusmer's work on progeneration, how the physical stuff involved in reproduction is passed down and creates lineages.
So evolutionary individuals are all about the long-term picture of inheritance and selection. But then we have physiological individuals. What are those about?
Right. Thomas Perdue is a big name in this area. He says a physiological individual is defined by its metabolism, how it uses energy, and its internal control mechanisms. It's a system with interdependent parts, all working together. And there's a whole history of research in physiology about how this unity of function works in living things.
So evolutionary individuality is about the long game, those changes across generations, while physiological individuality is about the here and now. It's about the processes happening inside an organism to keep it alive and functioning.
Exactly. And while older discussions about biological individuals acknowledge these physiological individuals, they mostly focused on the evolutionary side. Perdue has really brought that physiological perspective back. He even says that a typical organism is a specific type of physiological individual.
Okay.
And what makes it special is that it has well-integrated parts and, importantly, a systemic immune system.
So for Purdue, the immune system is super important. It sets the boundaries and keeps an organism together as a physiological individual.
Right?
And he sees these organisms as inherently mixed up with all those microbes they have, essentially making them holobionts from a physiological point of view.
You got it. It's a concise way to put it. His idea about immunity offers a way to define organisms as holobionts, directly addressing the challenges of microbialism. But the debate continues about whether holobionts are best understood as organisms or as evolutionary individuals, and if Purdue's view fully solves the problem of seeing symbionts as individuals themselves and as parts of a larger individual.
Okay, so at least we have these two big categories: evolutionary and physiological individuals. And organisms, they kind of sit at the intersection of those two, even though they don't fit perfectly in either. Which takes us to our third question, conceptual space. How do we make sense of all this?
Right, and recognizing the difference between evolutionary and physiological individuality means we have to accept that there are many ways to understand this.
Hmm.
But the entry discusses even more radical forms of pluralism.
Yeah.
We already talked about Dupre's promiscuous individualism.
Wait.
It's a very open view where what counts as a biological individual might depend more on what we are trying to understand and the specific context of our research, rather than something inherent in the biological world itself.
It's like for Dupre, the act of defining or classifying is what brings an individual into focus. Or at least it highlights one of many valid ways of seeing individuality in a complex biological system.
Yeah, you could say that. And this idea that a broad category like biological individual might be better understood by breaking it down into smaller, more specific subcategories. It appears in earlier work, too. Like Jack Wilson, he talked about genetic, functional, developmental, and evolutionary individuals. It's often called kind pluralism.
I see.
And the idea is that focusing on these more specific types of individuality can be more useful for explaining and predicting things in different areas of biology.
Okay. The entry also uses this helpful example from botany, the distinction between ramets and genets in plants. A ramet is what we usually think of as an individual plant, but a genet is a whole bunch of ramets that all came from the same original clone. So if you're asking how many plants are in this field, the answer depends on if you're counting ramets or genets.
Exactly. It shows how the way we categorize things changes our whole understanding of individuality.
Right. And this kind of pluralism can also come from looking at what biologists actually do in their different fields, like how a scientist who studies ciliates identifies an individual might be totally different from how a bird expert identifies an individual bird.
Right.
Philosopher Alan Love calls this strong individuality pluralism. It's the idea that for a given biological situation, there might be more than one right way to think about individuality.
Yeah,
And that even raises questions about whether biological individuals are really unique and how long they last. It makes this whole thing even more philosophically deep.
absolutely.
Okay, so we have all these different kinds of individuals and ways to define them. Is there any way to organize all this? Like the entry mentions Pepper and Heron. They came up with a system that uses the idea of the organism as a starting point.
Yeah, they suggest a framework where you categorize biological individuals based on their relationship to organisms.
Okay.
So they can be organisms themselves, parts of organisms, or groups of organisms. And these categories aren't always separate. Like a bacterium, it's an individual organism, but it could also be part of a bigger organism, like in our gut.
Right.
And some groups of organisms, like ant colonies, are so well integrated that they're practically a single organism, a superorganism.
So it's like they're trying to bring some order to all this by relating everything back to the organism, even while acknowledging that biological individuality goes beyond that. It helps us see how evolutionary and physiological individuality show up at different levels, considering things like growth, reproduction, cohesion, how the parts work together, and control mechanisms.
Exactly. And this framework sets us up to really explore the idea of groups as evolutionary individuals, which is what the entry looks at next.
Okay, so we talked about organisms and their parts. Now it's groups of organisms. So when can a whole group of organisms be considered a biological individual?
Right. The entry talks about the comeback of group selection theory. People like David Sloan Wilson and Elliot Sober really push that. And there's an important difference between superorganisms and trait groups.
Okay, break those down for me.
So superorganisms, like the name says, are groups that are so well integrated they act like one big organism.
Mhm.
Ant colonies and bee colonies are classic examples with their different roles and that division of labor, especially when it comes to reproduction. Trait groups are more general. There are groups where individuals in one part of a population have different chances of survival and reproduction than individuals in another part. So the idea is that natural selection can act not just on the individuals of these groups, but on the groups themselves.
But the entry points out a counterargument from evolutionary biology, that while selection can happen at the level of superorganisms, it's probably pretty rare. And what looks like trait group selection often can be explained by selection happening at the level of individual genes or organisms in a specific environment. So the idea of groups being common evolutionary individuals apart from these superorganisms, it's kind of up in the air.
Yeah, it is. And this idea goes even bigger, to the concepts of species selection and clade selection. Paleontologists like Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba, they said there are these huge evolutionary patterns driven by selection at the level of whole species or even clades, which are groups of species descended from a common ancestor. They compare them to individual organisms.
So are they saying that certain traits might make a species or clade more or less likely to survive and branch out over very long periods, regardless of the traits of the individuals in them?
Yeah. But again, the entry mentions there's a lot of skepticism,
Yeah.
especially the difference between species sorting and actual species selection. Like, just because we see different rates of new species forming or going extinct doesn't mean species are the main things being selected. It could just be the total effect of selection on the individuals in those species.
So just because we see a pattern doesn't necessarily mean it's the whole species evolving as a unit.
Right. And this connects to the whole species as individuals debate. This came about partly to challenge the view that species are fixed and unchanging. The idea was to think of species as these lineages that exist for a specific time and place, with individual organisms as their parts. That was a big change from how people used to think. And over time, the view has evolved, with more recent interpretations emphasizing that species are historical entities defined by their evolutionary path, not exactly like individual organisms.
Interesting.
A key point is that an organism's membership in a species is often determined by its interactions and things outside of it, not just its own internal features.
Okay. The entry even brings up the idea that all of life itself, from the very first common ancestor to everything that exists now, could be one giant biological individual.
Right.
It's like this species as individuals argument, but on a cosmic scale. It even suggests that maybe living things aren't even a real natural category. It seems like this question of what counts as an evolutionary individual at these higher levels is still wide open.
It really is. And this brings us to how physiological and evolutionary individuality relate to each other, especially when we think about life itself, reproduction, and agency.
Right, because evolutionary biology often focuses on genes, lineages, and clades.
Right.
A lot of that isn't living in the way we normally think of it, but physiological individuals, by definition, are alive. So to get the whole picture of biological individuality, we have to think about what it means to be alive.
For sure.
So the entry outlines one way to think about it. You try to define life or a living thing by finding a set of characteristics that are both necessary and sufficient.
Right.
And one thing that shows up a lot in those definitions is metabolism.
Yeah, it's all those chemical processes that keep an organism alive, breaking down molecules for energy and making new molecules. But definitions of life usually include other stuff too, both structural, like having specialized parts and being made of organic molecules, and functional, like the ability to grow, reproduce, and repair itself.
So a single cell or an organ in a multicellular organism would have many of those characteristics and would probably be considered a physiological individual.
Mm-hmm.
And a whole organism usually has all those properties, plus maybe an immune system, like Purdue talks about, or a complete life cycle that includes reproduction.
Exactly. So thinking of physiological individuals as these living agents and understanding that not every part or group of organisms is necessarily a living agent itself helps us refine our understanding. The entry has a helpful diagram that shows how organisms, organs, groups like coral reefs, all these fit within this framework of living agents.
Right. And that leads us to reproduction and life cycles. The entry says those are super important for both the gene-centered and the reproductively centered views of evolutionary individuals. And it's generally accepted that having a life cycle is a big part of being an individual organism.
Yeah. So a life cycle, generally it's a series of events or stages that a living thing goes through. It's a cycle because it starts and ends with the same kind of event, like a fertilized egg or cell division. Development is what happens between these stages, and reproduction is what leads to a new individual or individuals. Richard Dawkins' idea that an organism has to start and end with a single cell, that might be too simple, but the link between these bottlenecked life cycles and the distinctness of organisms is a strong one.
Right, but then the entry gets into all the crazy variation and complexity we see in life cycles across nature. Parasitic flukes, they live in multiple different hosts during their life cycle.
Yeah.
Insects go through those drastic changes with metamorphosis, and those are just a couple of examples. Life cycles can be incredibly different between species, and processes like that bottlenecking, sexual reproduction, increasing in number, those things often happen together, but they can also be separate or work in totally different ways.
Right. And philosopher James Geismer points out that this complexity can even make it hard to say what an organism actually is. Maureen O'Malley gives even weirder examples, like that protested Volvox cartery, where the sexual part of the life cycle doesn't actually increase the number of individuals. She came up with the idea of multi-generational individuals to explain these cases, where sexual recombination happens across multiple generations of asexual reproduction. It really makes us question our usual ideas about life cycles.
Okay, so reproduction is definitely connected to life cycles. But the entry stresses that being able to reproduce isn't necessarily what makes an organism an individual. A lot of individual organisms never reproduce themselves, and even the potential for reproduction isn't universal, like those sterile casts in ant and bee colonies.
Right. And in those cases, those individuals that don't reproduce rely on others in their lineage to do it for them. This leads to Peter Godfrey Smith's idea of scaffolded reproducers.
Okay, scaffolded reproducers.
They are entities that are reproduced as part of a bigger unit. They're different from simple reproducers, like a lot of bacteria, that reproduce on their own.
Okay.
Both of those can then be part of collective reproducers, like us or social groups, where the individual parts still have some ability to reproduce.
Interesting.
Godfrey Smith's ideas about collective reproduction help us see this whole spectrum of individuality and reproductive autonomy.
Okay. So finally, the entry talks about autonomous agency. It's pretty widely agreed that physiological individuals have some degree of autonomy. This is the basis for big theories about biological autonomy, like Maturana and Varela's idea of autopoiesis and Moreno and Massio's more recent work.
Right. These perspectives see the unity and goal-directedness of biological individuals as coming from basic principles of how life is organized. Physiological individuals, especially organisms, they're not just passive systems. They're active agents that can regulate themselves and are somewhat independent from their environment. This autonomy means being partly separated from the outside world and having control over your own parts. Purdue's emphasis on the immune boundary and Godfrey Smith's focus on integration, these are ways of explaining this idea of a locus of control.
Right. It's the sense of agency, this ability to act and have what we might call a life to lead that seems to make organisms more than just a bunch of living matter.
Yeah.
And the entry reminds us that this idea goes way back to people like Herbert Spencer and Julian Huxley, who both said that internal regulation and independence from outside forces were key features of biological individuals.
Right. And agency is still a big area of research in the philosophy of biology today. Thinkers like Dennis Walsh emphasize teleological agency, and they propose perspectives like methodological vitalism and the agential perspective. Fulda even argues that autonomous agency can be a general way to define biological individuality across all levels of organization.
It's funny how we use all these mental terms to describe biological agency.
It is.
The entry explores why we do that. Maybe it's because we try to understand biological things by comparing them to how we act. Or maybe it's because goal-directed behavior in organisms is similar to ideas in evolutionary theory. Or maybe we even take those descriptions of what cells and neurons do a little too literally. Godfrey Smith suggests that to really understand biological agency, we need to understand how subjectivity evolved.
Right. All of these discussions about life, reproduction, and agency, they all give us a richer understanding of where biological individuals fit in the bigger picture. And the entry then gives a more complete visual summary, building on earlier diagrams by adding in the category of Darwinian individuals. It shows how different examples, from fruit flies and genes to ant colonies, cell parts, whole groups of related species, organs, ecosystems, viruses, even symbiotic relationships like that squid Vibrio thing, they all fit within this multifaceted framework. It's a way to see how the distinctions between living agents, organisms, and Darwinian individuals help us categorize all this diversity in life.
Okay. And remember at the beginning how we said that some folks, like Queller and Strassman, just say that organisms and biological individuals are basically the same thing.
Right.
The entry then dives into their views on how these evolutionary individuals are regulated.
So Queller and Strassman, they're interested in what they call the evolution of organismality. They say what makes organisms special is that their parts cooperate a lot and there's little conflict.
Hmm.
And they see these as things that can vary, not just absolutes. So they came up with this two-dimensional space defined by these parameters to represent different biological individuals. They introduced this internal ratio, which measures the balance of cooperation and conflict within an individual. It's a way to quantify how much individuality it has.
It's really interesting how they try to measure this idea of internal harmony. The entry also suggests that this could be expanded by thinking about an external ratio, which would be the balance of cooperation and conflict between an individual and its environment, and even a meta ratio that combines both the internal and external stuff. They say this could help us understand how new forms of individuals evolve.
Right. And then there's Ellen Clark. She has a more integrated view, focusing on the mechanisms that regulate evolutionary individuals. She emphasizes policing mechanisms that suppress selection happening within an individual by reducing genetic differences between its parts.
Okay.
And then there are demarcating mechanisms that promote selection between individuals by keeping those genetic or physical differences between them.
So policing is about keeping the peace inside, and demarcation is about making sure individuals stay separate so that natural selection can work on them as individuals.
Yeah. And for Clark, what those mechanisms do is the most important thing, not how they're physically made.
Mm-hmm.
She calls this a thoroughgoing functionalism about individuality. And this lets her challenge the idea that you have to have a single-celled bottleneck during development to be an evolutionary individual, which could mean that things like biofilms might actually be evolutionary individuals.
But does Clark agree with that?
Well, the entry says that Clark actually disagrees with the idea of biofilms as evolutionary individuals. She says that some of the key claims about their unity and how they pass on traits aren't backed up by evidence or are just plain wrong. Her system allows for non-genetic ways of inheriting traits, but she thinks the evidence for that in biofilms is shaky.
Got it. So finally, we get to the evolution of biological individuality itself. The entry says that the history of life can be seen as this progression towards more complex and integrated individuals built from simpler parts. And it's mostly driven by natural selection happening at different levels. There's this idea of hierarchical organization where simpler forms of individuals are the building blocks for more complex ones later, like how prokaryotic cells came before eukaryotic cells, which then led to multicellular organisms.
Right. These big evolutionary transitions, they're like milestones. But the specifics of how they happened are still debated. The entry highlights 5 main areas where this discussion is still going on.
Okay, hit me with them.
Okay, first, the idea of fitness transfer, or decoupling, where the success of the new collective individual becomes more important than the success of its parts. But some people are questioning this, saying that other things might explain these transitions, like trait-based trade-off breaking, where ecology and how populations are structured are more important. Second, there's this assumption that evolving individuality always means getting more complex. But the entry asks how we even measure biological.